When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the fiercest voices in Congress, told John Kennedy to sit down, boy, in front of millions, no one expected the response that followed. What happened? Not just the room, but all of America. The room was electric with tension as the debate raged on in Congress. The spotlight was on two political titans, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, known for her fiery speeches and relentless energy, and John Kennedy, the Louisiana senator whose sharp wit and calm demeanor made him a respected figure, even in the heated halls of Congress. The battle of ideas was intense, each politician arguing their point with passion. But then, something unexpected happened. Standing at the podium, AOC's voice cut through the air. "Sit down, boy," she snapped, her words aimed directly at Kennedy. The room fell into stunned silence. AOC, often admired for her boldness, had crossed a line. The insult hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Her words were not just an attack on his political stance, but on his character, reducing him to something small, something lesser. Kennedy, the man known for his unflappable composure, paused. His eyes flicked over to AOC, but his face remained unreadable. The world was watching. Every camera in the room trained on him. What would he do? Would he rise to the bait, or would he take the high road? The tension in the room was palpable as everyone held their breath, waiting for Kennedy's response. Would he fall into the trap? Or would he do something no one expected? Kennedy's response. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, as though the entire country was holding its breath. AOC had delivered her blow, sharp and pointed, and now, the eyes of the nation were on John Kennedy. Would he snap back with equal venom? Would he let his emotions get the better of him? Or would he, as he always did, maintain the calm and poise of the true Southern gentleman? For a few heart-stopping seconds, Kennedy didn't move. His lips were slightly parted, and his expression, though unreadable, carried the weight of the insult. It was as though he was calculating the perfect response, weighing his options with the precision of a seasoned politician. The silence was deafening. The camera flashes from the media swarmed like lightning bugs, their flashes a stark contrast to the tense stillness in the room. AOC stood there, waiting, her expression a mixture of defiance and expectation. She had thrown the gauntlet down, and now it was up to Kennedy to pick it up or walk away. But this was John Kennedy, a man known for his sharp wit, quick comebacks, and dry humor. He was never one to back down, especially when it mattered most. And this, he knew, mattered. The crowd could feel it. They sensed that something big was about to happen. The press boxes buzzed as reporters leaned in, ready to capture every word. The cameras zoomed in on Kennedy's face, watching for any sign of emotion. But he was the picture of calm. Slowly, deliberately, he stood from his chair. The audience collectively held their breath as Kennedy stepped to the microphone, his eyes steady and his posture erect. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't angry. Instead, there was a subtle confidence in his movements, the kind that only comes from years of experience, of facing challenges head-on, and knowing that the best way to win was to stay true to yourself. Finally, Kennedy spoke, his voice deep and deliberate, carrying across the room with the weight of authority. "You know, Alexandria, I may be from Louisiana, but I'm no boy. And I'm certainly not your boy." The words echoed through the room like thunder. There was no anger, no desperation in his voice, just a quiet power that made everyone stop and think. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a statement of self-respect, of dignity, and most of all of standing your ground even when provoked. For a split second there was absolute silence. The crowd was stunned. No one had expected this. They had anticipated a clash of egos, a fiery back and forth that would add fuel to the already blazing fire of partisan politics. But instead, Kennedy had diffused the situation with the calm precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Sure. The room erupted into whispers as people processed what had just happened. Even AOC seemed taken aback, her expression flickering between surprise and discomfort. For a moment it looked as though she wasn't sure how to respond. But Kennedy wasn't finished. With a sly smile, he added, "If you want to challenge me, Alexandria, you better be ready for what comes next. But remember, the game isn't always won by the loudest voice. Sometimes it's the quietest one that speaks the truth." The impact of his words was instantaneous. AOC's posture shifted slightly, and for the first time, the audience could sense her discomfort. She had been caught off guard. And as Kennedy's words hung in the air, the crowd knew they had just witnessed something far bigger than just a political clash. They had witnessed the power of dignity and self-respect. Kennedy didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to shout or throw insults. He had made his point with nothing more than a few carefully chosen words and a calm demeanor. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from fighting fire with fire, but from showing the world that you're unshakable in the face of adversity. The tension in the room was palpable, the atmosphere thick with the weight of Kennedy's words. What had just happened wasn't just another political exchange. It was a moment that would go down in history. In the seconds following his response, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for someone to react. But there was nothing. The media were stunned. The reporters, usually quick to pounce on the slightest misstep, were frozen in place. The cameras clicked incessantly, capturing every second of the stunned silence. AOC, once brimming with her usual fiery confidence, now stood motionless at the podium, her face a picture of surprise and perhaps regret. She had expected a fiery retort, a heated argument that would spark the kind of controversy she thrived on. But what she hadn't expected was the quiet strength of a man who had faced far worse and had learned how to respond with grace. Slowly, AOC regained her composure, her eyes narrowing, but there was no immediate response. Instead, the debate continued in a dull murmur. The damage, however, had already been done. Kennedy's words had cut through the political noise, rising above the clamor of daily political discourse. His message was simple yet powerful. Respect is earned, and it is never to be undermined regardless of your position. In the days that followed, the media frenzy erupted. News outlets from across the country began to cover the incident, with headlines reading, "Kennedy's quiet power shakes Washington," and "AOC's insult backfires as Kennedy responds with dignity." Social media exploded as clips of the exchange went viral. Hashtags like #Kennedy vs AOC, #SitDownBoy, and #Respect Earned trended for days, sparking debates across the nation. But the most profound reactions came from ordinary Americans. People, who had been tuning into the debate, hoping for a typical political brawl, found themselves captivated by Kennedy's calm and collected demeanor. For many, it was a breath of fresh air. In a political climate where division, name-calling, and insults were the norm, Kennedy had proven that strength didn't have to be loud, it didn't have to be brash. It could be quiet, composed, and powerful in its own way. On social media, people from both sides of the aisle began to praise Kennedy for his response. Comment sections were flooded with comments from supporters and even some of his usual critics. "This is how you handle disrespect," one tweet read. "Kennedy didn't need to stoop to her level. He showed class," another said. Even celebrities and public figures jumped in, sharing their thoughts on the moment. But while many were rallying behind Kennedy, there were others who felt that AOC had gone too far. Some even questioned her judgment in trying to provoke a well-respected figure like Kennedy. "You can't disrespect someone like that and expect it to go unnoticed," said one columnist, while another argued, "If AOC had played it differently, this would have been a victory for her." Now, it's a lesson in why dignity matters. Despite the growing support for Kennedy, AOC's team attempted to downplay the situation. They issued a statement claiming that her comment had been made in the heat of the moment and wasn't meant to be disrespectful. But it was clear to everyone that the damage had already been done. The public's perception of the incident was shaped by Kennedy's calm and confident response. It wasn't about the political sides anymore. It was about the values of respect and integrity. Kennedy, however, remained unshaken by the storm. Instead of engaging in a back and forth with AOC or any of his critics, he focused on his work. His response had been a message not just to AOC but to the nation. A reminder that in a world where words are often used as weapons, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay grounded, keep your dignity, and rise above the noise. As the days wore on, Kennedy's message continued to resonate. His approval ratings saw an uptick, with many Americans applauding his maturity and leadership. What had started as a moment of insult had transformed into an opportunity for Kennedy to remind the public of the importance of staying true to one's values, no matter the situation. For AOC, the moment served as a harsh reminder that in the world of politics, respect is a two-way street, and it's earned, not demanded. The ripple effect behind closed doors, the effects of that moment continued to ripple through both political parties. Within Congress, whispers began to circulate. Some praised Kennedy for his ability to maintain composure in the face of personal insult, while others quietly acknowledged that AOC had miscalculated. She had tried to undermine a respected figure, but instead, she had inadvertently given him a platform to show what true leadership looked like. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, Kennedy's hometown, his response became the talk of the town. People who had once viewed him as a traditional, old-school politician began to see him in a new light. He was more than just a senator. He was a man who stood for something greater than partisan politics, a man who understood that strength was not always loud or brash, but often it was quiet and resolute. The fallout from the exchange between Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and John Kennedy didn't just stay confined to the walls of Congress. It rippled out into the streets, the homes, the kitchens, and offices across America. The moment, which had initially seemed like just another political dust-up, quickly became something much larger. What had started with a cruel insult turned into a defining moment for both politicians, but more importantly, for the American public watching it unfold. In Washington, the political commentators, the pundits, and the talking heads on cable news were consumed with it. Late-night talk shows couldn't resist making jokes, but the punchlines were no longer about AOC's quip. They were about Kennedy's cool, collected response. He had handled it with grace, something the media hadn't expected from a man who, by all accounts, was known more for his Southern charm and folksy wisdom than his razor-sharp comebacks. The media, hungry for a story, began to dissect the exchange in endless detail. Kennedy's calm response, a lesson in leadership, was a common headline. Politicians, commentators, and everyday citizens alike began to weigh in on what had just happened. Some praised Kennedy for staying composed under pressure, while others were left wondering, how had a simple response to an insult become such a significant moment in American politics? But what was truly remarkable was how Kennedy himself handled the storm. He didn't engage with the media's obsession over the incident, nor did he try to stoke the fire. He continued doing what he always did, working tirelessly, focusing on the issues that mattered most to his constituents. His response, though public and powerful, was ultimately a moment of reflection, a reminder of the core values he had long championed, both in his political career and personal life. He remained unwavering in his belief that dignity should never be sacrificed, even in the heat of battle. Kennedy's quiet confidence resonated with people from all walks of life. From rural towns in Louisiana to the bustling streets of New York City, Americans were watching, and they were impressed. They were tired of the endless bickering in Washington, the back and forth that achieved nothing except more division. What Kennedy had done was simple yet profound. He had stood his ground, faced disrespect with dignity, and refused to let the noise of politics cloud his sense of self. Across social media, Kennedy's response went viral. The clips from the debate flooded Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Videos of his powerful retort were shared by millions, with hashtags like #Kennedy vs AOC, #RespectICerned, and #DignityOverDivision taking over the trends. People started to rally around him, not because of his political stance, but because of his ability to remain true to his principles. It wasn't just Republicans praising him. Democrats, independents, and even those who had never supported his policies began to speak up. They were not endorsing his politics, but they were acknowledging his character. For many, the question was no longer about left or right, red or blue. It was about leadership. And Kennedy had shown leadership in a way that felt fresh, authentic, and deeply human. One tweet summed up the sentiment perfectly. We need more leaders who speak the truth with grace and stand by their values. Kennedy just reminded us of what true leadership looks like. The tweet received thousands of retweets, a small but telling reflection of the wider public's mood. But while Kennedy was basking in this newfound admiration, AOC found herself facing the consequences of her actions. The fallout for her was more complicated. As a progressive leader, she had built a reputation as someone who wasn't afraid to push the envelope, to challenge authority, and to speak her mind. But her words had crossed a line, and the public's response was swift and unforgiving. While many of her supporters remained loyal, others began to question her approach. The insult to Kennedy was seen as not just an attack on him, but an attack on the institution of the Senate, a body that, though often criticized, still commanded respect from many Americans. AOC's tactic of confrontation had worked in the past, but this time it backfired. Some of her supporters began to wonder if her strategy of constant confrontation was doing more harm than good. Had she become too focused on being combative rather than building bridges? Could her desire to tear down the establishment actually be making her more isolated from the very people she needed to win over? Even within her own party, there was talk. Some lawmakers privately expressed concern over how she handled the exchange. A few suggested that her words were unnecessarily divisive, and that a more measured approach might have served her cause better. While AOC remained defiant in public, the whispers within the halls of Congress grew louder. AOC's team quickly tried to deflect blame, arguing that her comment had been made in the heat of the moment and wasn't meant to be taken seriously. But it was clear that the damage had been done. She had underestimated the backlash her words would provoke, not just from her opponents, but from those who had once supported her methods. Her supporters who had championed her for her boldness now found themselves questioning whether this was the kind of leadership they wanted to follow. On the other hand, Kennedy's approval ratings soared. A man who had always been seen as a steady, reliable figure now became a symbol of integrity. A man who could stand up to the partisan bickering and set an example for how to handle conflict. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to insult. He simply stood tall and responded with grace, and America had noticed. As the weeks passed, Kennedy continued to draw praise from across the political spectrum. He made a point of saying that it wasn't about the incident itself, but about reminding people that leadership was about character, not confrontation. His message was clear. If you want to change the world, you don't do it by tearing others down, you do it by showing up, standing firm, and doing what's right no matter who's watching. And so, what had started as a tense moment in a heated political debate transformed into something much greater. It became a moment of reflection for the country. Kennedy's response became a beacon of leadership that transcended politics, reminding Americans everywhere that dignity and respect were the foundation of true leadership. As for AOC, the incident remained a defining moment in her career, one that would undoubtedly be revisited in the years to come. But whether she learned from it or continued on the same path of fiery confrontation remained to be seen. What was clear, however, was that Kennedy had come out of the exchange not just unscathed, but stronger, and in the end, that's what mattered. As the weeks turned into months, the fallout from the exchange between AOC and John Kennedy continued to shape the political landscape. What initially appeared to be just another fiery moment in a contentious debate between two political figures had transformed into something much more significant. It was a defining moment for both Kennedy and AOC, one that would follow them through the rest of their careers. Kennedy's surge in popularity. For John Kennedy, the aftermath of his response to AOC's insult was nothing short of a political renaissance. His calm and composed handling of the situation had made him a symbol of grace under pressure, and his popularity soared. The media, which had once dismissed him as a regional figure with a charming but somewhat outdated persona, now saw him in a new light. He wasn't just a Southern senator, he was a leader who could stand up to the partisan vitriol of Washington and respond with dignity, a trait that was becoming all too rare in modern politics. Kennedy's approval ratings saw a significant spike. A recent poll revealed that more than 70% of Americans, across party lines, admired his ability to maintain his composure in the face of provocation. The moment had resonated deeply with voters, especially those who were tired of the never-ending, partisan bickering and wanted leaders who could rise above it. For the first time in years, Kennedy's name began to appear in discussions about the future of the Republican Party. Though he was seen as a staunch conservative, his response to AOC had transcended politics. It wasn't just about Republican or Democrat anymore, it was about character. People across the political spectrum began to view him as a model of leadership that didn't rely on divisive rhetoric or sensationalism. Instead, it was grounded in honesty, integrity, and respect for others. His response to AOC also gave Kennedy the opportunity to speak about issues that were dear to him: the importance of respectful discourse in politics, the need for unity in a divided country, and the value of civility. He began to make more appearances on news programs, in interviews, and at public events, talking not just about policy, but about the role of character in leadership. Kennedy's newfound visibility didn't come without its challenges, though. His critics, especially those within his own party, began to question whether he had become too soft in his approach to politics. Some felt that his class act response had given AOC and her supporters too much leeway. But Kennedy, ever the master of measured responses, dismissed these concerns with his signature wit. "I may not always be the loudest voice in the room," he said, "but I believe a whisper can be just as powerful as a shout, if you know what to say." Over time, his image shifted from that of just another politician to that of a statesman. The moment with AOC had solidified his place as someone who could transcend partisan lines and earn the respect of the American people. AOC's struggle and rebuilding on the other side of the political spectrum, AOC found herself struggling to recover from the fallout. While she still maintained a strong base of support among her progressive allies, the incident with Kennedy had cast a shadow over her leadership. For the first time in her political career, AOC's actions were called into question, not just by her critics but by some of her own supporters. Her initial response, a quick attempt to downplay the incident and dismiss it as a heat-of-the-moment remark, did little to quell the growing criticism. While some of her most ardent followers continued to rally behind her, others began to express disappointment in her approach. The political climate was shifting, and AOC's confrontational style, which had once been praised for its boldness, now seemed, to some, reckless. As the media storm continued to churn, AOC faced tough questions. Some journalists asked whether her brand of politics, built on antagonism and rebellion, was the right approach for a country that was yearning for healing and unity. Her support among young progressives remained strong, but more moderate Democrats began to question whether she could win over the broader electorate. If her tactics didn't evolve, she tried to pivot, refocusing her efforts on policy issues that resonated with her base. She introduced new bills on healthcare, climate change, and income inequality, all while attempting to repair the damage done to her image. But it wasn't enough. The Kennedy incident had changed the narrative. It had shifted the conversation from her policy achievements to her character, and the damage, although not irreparable, would take time to fix. In the weeks following the exchange, AOC made several public statements acknowledging her mistake. She apologized for her words, calling them inappropriate and out of line. But the damage was done. For some, the apology came across as too little, too late. It was clear that AOC had underestimated the power of words, and that sometimes in the high-stakes game of politics, one poorly chosen moment could shift the trajectory of an entire career. Despite the setback, AOC remained resolute. She knew that politics was a game of survival, and if she wanted to continue to lead, she would need to show the public that she had learned from her mistakes. Her challenge now was to rebuild the trust of those who had been disappointed by her actions and to prove that she could be both a fierce advocate for progressive change and a more thoughtful, measured leader. The media frenzy. The media played a pivotal role in shaping the aftermath of the exchange. News outlets, in their quest for sensationalism, couldn't resist covering every angle of the story. Headlines like Kennedy's dignity versus AOC's fury and how one moment in Congress could define their careers dominated the news cycle. But the most telling part of the coverage wasn't the back and forth between the two politicians. It was the broader conversation about leadership and respect. In talk shows, on social media, and across newsrooms, Americans began discussing what they valued in their leaders. Was it the fiery rhetoric of a challenger who wasn't afraid to take on the establishment? Or was it the calm, measured response of a seasoned politician who understood the weight of his words? The public's reaction was mixed, but the fact that this conversation was happening at all was a sign that something deeper had shifted in the national consciousness. For Kennedy, the media frenzy had one key effect. It forced a conversation about the future of politics and the role of respect in leadership. His response to AOC wasn't just about defending himself. It was about offering a vision for how American politics could and should be conducted. The fallout from the exchange became a rallying cry for those who were tired of the negativity and personal attacks that had come to define political discourse. A legacy in the making. As the months passed, it became clear that the incident between AOC and Kennedy was not just a moment of political drama, but a defining event that would shape their careers for years to come. For Kennedy, it cemented his legacy as a man of character and dignity, someone who could be trusted to rise above the noise of politics and lead with grace. His approval ratings continued to rise, and he became a more prominent figure within his party. For AOC, the road to redemption was long and difficult. The incident had exposed cracks in her image, but it also provided an opportunity for growth. She could either choose to double down on her confrontational style or evolve into a more nuanced and strategic leader. The choice, ultimately, was hers. But one thing was clear. The AOC who had faced Kennedy in that debate would never be the same. As time passed, the ripples of the exchange between John Kennedy and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez spread far beyond Washington, D.C. and the media cycle. The two politicians who had once been rivals in the realm of political discourse were now both defined by that single moment. The moment when AOC had insulted Kennedy, and he had, with incredible grace, silenced her with a few simple words. For Kennedy, the aftermath of that exchange had solidified his position as one of the most respected voices in Congress. But while he received praise from all sides, the pressure to continue living up to the example he had set only increased. His career, already well established, now entered a new phase, one where his actions would be scrutinized with even greater intensity. His handling of the moment had earned him admiration, but it had also set an expectation that he would continue to be a beacon of civility and dignity in a polarized political environment. Kennedy's steady rise, a symbol of stability. Kennedy, ever the strategist, understood the weight of this newfound spotlight. He knew that he had just gone through something rare in the world of politics, a defining moment that transcended party lines and political ideologies. Instead of simply basking in the public's admiration, he immediately went to work, doubling down on the issues that mattered most to his constituents. He brought attention to the importance of unity in the political process, focusing on issues that had traditionally been divisive. While his colleagues in Congress continued to battle over healthcare, taxes, and defense spending, Kennedy made it clear that he was focused on creating solutions, not just tearing down the other side. His subtle, steady approach to leadership began to resonate with the American people, those tired of the constant bickering and division in Washington. Kennedy's approval ratings continued to climb, and soon he became the go-to figure for those searching for a leader who could bridge the divide between polarized factions. He wasn't just seen as a member of the Republican Party. He was a voice of reason and a symbol of strength through civility and respect. His calm demeanor, which had been tested during the AOC exchange, became the hallmark of his political brand. But Kennedy, ever self-aware, knew that this new image would come with its own set of challenges. He was now expected to maintain the standard of grace he had set, and every move he made would be watched closely. He couldn't afford to slip into the old habits of partisan warfare that had consumed much of Washington. Instead, he leaned into his values, continuing to prioritize dialogue over division and listening over shouting. Kennedy's post-AOC response era wasn't without its obstacles, though. Critics from both sides of the political spectrum attempted to undermine his newfound image, accusing him of being too soft or too quiet in a world that often demanded bold statements. But Kennedy brushed off these criticisms with his usual charm, responding only with more actions, not words. His focus remained on building coalitions and crafting legislation that would benefit the people of Louisiana and the nation. As the months went on, Kennedy's steady hand in the Senate made him one of the most influential figures in American politics, respected not only for his policies but for his unwavering commitment to staying true to his principles. His reputation as a statesman grew stronger, and his supporters continued to rally behind him as the politician who had shown America that leadership didn't always have to come with a fight. AOC's struggle, regaining trust, and political identity. The other side of the political spectrum, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's struggle to recover from the AOC Kennedy moment was a long and often painful journey. The public's reaction had been swift, and while some of her most ardent supporters remained loyal, there were cracks beginning to show in the foundation of her career. AOC had always prided herself on being the voice of the progressive movement, a fierce advocate for social justice, climate action, and income equality. But now, with the fallout from the Kennedy exchange, she found herself caught between maintaining her combative, confrontational style and learning to adopt a more strategic approach. Her base, though still strong, began to question whether she could balance her passionate rhetoric with the kind of diplomacy that the current political climate demanded. The next few months were filled with reflection for AOC. She had always prided herself on being unapologetically bold, but had this moment with Kennedy shown her that sometimes boldness without strategy could do more harm than good? She had not only alienated Kennedy, but also created a rift between herself and many of the moderate Democrats who had once seen her as a promising figure for the future of the party. Though AOC continued to advocate for policies like the Green New Deal and Medicare for All, she began to experience growing pains. The media coverage, once focused on her fiery speeches and activism, now increasingly questioned her ability to work with others. The question of whether she could build bridges with people across the aisle had been raised, and though many of her supporters felt she could continue to lead with boldness, a significant portion of the American public was wondering if it was time for her to evolve. A turning point. Lessons in leadership. It wasn't long before AOC realized that the incident with Kennedy had forced her into a corner. The legacy of that moment would always be a part of her political identity. It wasn't just a quick exchange in a debate. It was the moment when her style of confrontation had collided with a political figure who responded with unyielding dignity. AOC took stock of what had happened. She reflected on the public's response to Kennedy's measured response and what it said about what Americans were looking for in their leaders. She realized that perhaps her next steps needed to be more deliberate, more focused on listening, more open to collaboration. While she would never abandon her values, she now understood the importance of balancing passion with pragmatism. The road to redemption for AOC wasn't a quick one. She needed time to rebuild trust, not only with those who had been disappointed by her actions, but with herself. She began working closely with other lawmakers, learning how to negotiate, compromise, and lead without always having to fight. AOC's transformation became a story of growth. She wasn't the same fiery figure who had taken on Kennedy in the Senate. She was someone evolving, striving to be a more complete leader, one who understood that being bold didn't always mean being combative. The aftershocks of a moment. The weeks following their encounter, both Kennedy and AOC had grown from their experience, in different ways. Kennedy had reinforced his position as a man of dignity, rising above the chaos of political warfare. He became an enduring symbol of respect and leadership, a man who led not by loud rhetoric, but by quiet strength AOC, meanwhile, emerged from the incident with a redefined sense of her political identity. She recognized that the moment with Kennedy had tested her in a way that no campaign or bill ever had. It was a challenge not just to her political views, but to her character. The lessons she learned about respect, about the need for strategic thinking, about the power of listening, would shape the remainder of her career. What had started as a moment of tension between two political figures had ultimately become a turning point for both of them, a moment that would shape their futures for years to come. For Kennedy, the encounter was a chance to show America the power of quiet leadership. For AOC, it was a moment of reckoning, a chance to grow, to evolve, and to learn from her mistakes. And as the years passed, that moment remained a defining part of their legacies, a reminder that the most powerful moments in politics are often the ones that come when you least expect them. As the years passed, the moment between John Kennedy and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became more than just a political skirmish. It was a defining chapter in both of their careers, a moment that would be talked about for generations. It was a moment that transcended politics and became a powerful lesson in leadership, character, and respect. Values that were, and still, are desperately needed in a deeply divided political world. Kennedy's enduring legacy. For John Kennedy, the aftermath of that moment with AOC continued to shape his career in ways he could not have predicted. What had initially seemed like a fleeting incident had become a cornerstone of his public identity, a symbol of his calmness, wit, and above all, his unwavering commitment to dignity in the face of adversity. Over the years, Kennedy's response to AOC's insult became a central part of his political persona. His measured, dignified response resonated deeply with the American public. People didn't just remember him as a senator from Louisiana. They remembered him as the man who had faced an insult with grace, the man who had reminded the nation that leadership wasn't about shouting the loudest, but standing firm in your beliefs. His reputation as a statesman only grew stronger. As the years went by, Kennedy became one of the most respected voices in Congress, not just within his party, but across the aisle. He continued to be a voice of reason in an increasingly polarized world. His approach to politics, grounded in civility and respect, became a beacon of hope for those disillusioned by the toxic partisanship that had come to dominate American politics. Kennedy's political legacy wasn't just defined by his policies, but by the way he carried himself. He was a living example of how a politician could navigate the rough waters of Washington without losing their integrity. His response to AOC had been more than a political retort. It had been a lesson in human decency, in respecting others, and in staying true to your values even when the world seems to be pushing you to compromise them. As his influence grew, Kennedy became a mentor to younger politicians, teaching them that while it was important to stand up for what you believed in, it was equally important to stand up with dignity. His words and actions reverberated across the political landscape, reminding America that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to remain unshaken in the face of provocation. AOC's redemption and new path forward for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The journey after that moment with Kennedy was one of reflection, growth, and ultimately redemption. The exchange had been a wake-up call, a reminder that the political arena wasn't just about being bold and loud. It was also about knowing when to step back, assess the situation, and respond with the kind of thoughtfulness that could carry you forward. AOC spent the years following the incident, wrestling with the tension between her progressive ideals and the public's growing desire for cooperative leadership. She had always seen herself as a revolutionary force, someone who wasn't afraid to confront the system head-on. But the aftermath of the AOC-Kennedy exchange showed her that being confrontational didn't always win the respect of the people. She realized that leadership wasn't just about challenging the system, it was about building coalitions, finding common ground, and knowing when to pick your battles. Though her base of support remained strong, AOC's ability to grow beyond her initial image as a fiery, combative figure became a central theme of her political evolution. Over the years, she began to adopt a more strategic approach to her leadership. She learned to balance her impassioned speeches with moments of reflection, to pair her bold ideas with a willingness to listen and engage in dialogue. She recognized that in order to effect real change, she would need to broaden her approach and work with others, even those who didn't share all of her views. AOC's transformation was gradual, but it was undeniable. She became more adept at forging partnerships with other lawmakers, finding ways to work across the aisle on issues like climate change, healthcare, and social justice. While she never abandoned her progressive vision, she learned to temper her approach, understanding that leadership meant both advocating fiercely for your values and collaborating when necessary to achieve results. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. AOC learned to accept the idea that leadership wasn't always about having the loudest voice or the boldest words. Sometimes, it was about knowing when to step back, reflect, and allow the strength of your actions to speak louder than any words. She had learned the lesson of humility, that even the strongest leaders needed to listen, to grow, and to evolve. In the years following her encounter with Kennedy, AOC's political career took on a more balanced tone. While she remained a staunch advocate for progressive policies, she was now seen as a more well-rounded and strategic leader, someone capable of engaging with a variety of political perspectives while staying true to her core values. The nation reflects a changed political landscape. The legacy of that exchange didn't just define Kennedy and AOC. It had a transformative effect on the entire political landscape. In the years following the event, the American public began to demand more from their leaders. The lesson of respect and dignity that Kennedy embodied, and the subsequent growth of AOC, became a turning point in the way politics were viewed. Americans, frustrated by the endless partisanship and polarization, began to crave leaders who could rise above the fray, who could engage in tough conversations without resorting to insults or empty rhetoric. The country needed politicians who could lead with integrity and respect. And in that moment between Kennedy and AOC, the public had witnessed a glimpse of what that kind of leadership could look like. While the political world continued to be filled with controversy and disagreement, the exchange between Kennedy and AOC remained a poignant reminder that true leadership wasn't about who could shout the loudest or win the most arguments. It was about standing firm in your convictions, listening to others, and finding ways to move forward together, even in the face of deep divisions. A lasting impact as Kennedy's career continued to thrive, and AOC's journey of growth continued. To inspire, their exchange became a powerful symbol of the changing nature of politics in America. Both figures had learned from the moment in different ways, but the lessons of that day stayed with them, and with the nation. Respect, dignity, and integrity were values that, though often overlooked in modern politics, were now firmly back in the spotlight. In the years to come, as the political climate continued to evolve, the story of Kennedy and AOC would be retold, not just as a moment of conflict, but as a moment of transformation. It was a reminder that leadership was not defined by who could make the most noise, but by who could remain steady, strong, and true to their values in the face of adversity. And so, the legacy of that moment lived on, not just in the careers of John Kennedy and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but in the hearts and minds of Americans who had learned that, in politics and in life, the true measure of a leader is not just in what they say, but in how they respond when it matters most. What do you think? Did Kennedy's calm response set the standard for leadership, or did AOC's challenge spark the change we need in politics? Drop your thoughts below,